Bonsoir et good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine Spencer-Ross, and I'm president of Heritage Ottawa and chair of its lecture series committee. Welcome to this evening's lecture. First, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is at the heart of a vast homeland whose history reaches back long before the development of the National Capital Region as we now know it. For hundreds of years, Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples have been pressing for their Indigenous rights to be respected and their history to be understood. Heritage Ottawa makes efforts through our programs and partnerships to bring awareness to Algonquin history and heritage with events and programming. Our free lecture series is made possible with the generous support of our leadership sponsor, Sandy Smallwood and Andrex Holdings, and of Merkley Supply Limited. We're also grateful for grants from the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario. I'd like to thank those of you who are members of Heritage Ottawa and who have made donations to the organization, and I encourage this great way to support our work. Please visit our website at heritageottawa.org for details. Turning to this evening's presentation, I'm delighted to host our Emerging Scholars Lecture. Each year, we devote our October presentation to highlighting the research undertaken by students, usually from our local universities or colleges, which offers a fresh perspective on Ottawa's heritage. Tonight, Carleton University scholars will recount stories of the Hintonburg community of Ottawa through its buildings and the people who built them. Their research emerged from a seminar course taught by Professor Peter Kaufman last winter through Carleton's History and Theory of Architecture program. The students benefited from advice and guidance provided by the History and Heritage Committee of the Hintonburg Community Association. At the end of this evening's presentation, we will have a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Heritage Ottawa Vice President of Operations and Hintonburg resident and activist Linda Hode. Thank you, Linda, for taking on this role. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for this evening, who in turn will introduce his students. Peter Kaufman is an architecture historian and associate professor in Carleton University's History and Theory of Architecture program. He specializes in the architecture of the Middle Ages and its revivals. He's the author of the book Newfoundland Gothic, as well as numerous scholarly articles in Canadian and European periodicals and books. He has also written about buildings in several newspapers and magazines, and can usually be counted on to speak up when a controversial architectural issue arises in Ottawa. He has degrees from the University of Toronto, Toronto Metropolitan University, York University, and Queen's University. He's also an award-winning photographer. Peter is well-traveled in Canada and abroad, and if you're lucky to be enrolled in one of his courses, you'll see how he turns what he sees into teaching opportunities. In his spare time, Peter served on the board of Heritage Ottawa and was for 2 terms president of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada. He was instrumental in hosting that organization's 50th anniversary conference here in Ottawa last spring. Peter, thank you for sharing your students with us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that, Catherine. And thank you to everybody. I would normally say nice to see you, but I'll say nice to know you're here instead. But I'm really, really pleased to be here tonight, actually, because this is the culmination of what has really been kind of a dream project for me. And I'll set it up with a bit of context, because the seeds of this were planted about 2 years ago when I was on sabbatical. And while I was on sabbatical, I was planning a 4th-year seminar for the year of my return, but I hadn't worked out what it would be about yet. And around that time, I got an email, actually just the newsletter from the Hintonburg Community Association. And like Linda, I'm a very proud and happy resident of Hintonburg, which is a wonderful, wonderful neighborhood in Ottawa. Anyway, I got their newsletter, and one of the items in the newsletter was that the Heritage Committee was looking for people to help doing research on historic buildings in Hintonburg. And I began to think, they're looking for people who can do research into historic buildings. I'm going to be teaching a seminar next year, which is in search of a topic. Maybe I can pull these things together. So I got together with Jean Inch and Linda Hode, the Heritage Committee of the HCA. And we agreed that, yes, this would be a win-win-win for everybody. And so for me, I got to work with my students. I got to work with my neighbors on a project about my neighborhood, and my students got to work with my neighbors in the community association, what amounted to an external client. So it was just a wonderful experience for everybody. The way it worked is that each student was assigned a single building to work on, and then all these projects came together at the end of the year, and we had a sort of big collective project. Now, just to be clear, the result of this big collective project doesn't attempt or pretend to be a comprehensive history of Hintonburg by any means. I don't think there really is such thing. But what it is, in a way, is a tapestry of stories about Hintonburg, and we're going to hear some of those stories tonight. So probably the best way to think of what you're going to see tonight is think of it as a sort of composite portrait of Hintonburg in 5 buildings. And we're going to see domestic architecture, commercial architecture, and industrial architecture. So there's quite a good range of building types. Now, that portrait is actually in the process of going online, and I'm just going to share my screen here. But that is the homepage of an ongoing Carleton project that we've had in the History and Theory of Architecture program for a few years now, called the Virtual Museum of Architecture in Ottawa. And as you'll see, there are 3 choices across the top. And if we go to Hintonburg, then you will see a little introduction and then browse projects. You'll see half a dozen projects up there, some of which you'll be getting parts of tonight. And if you go into those projects, then you'll see you've got an introduction, and then you have various choices within that you can go to. In any event, this is where bulk of this material is going to end up is on the Hintonburg page of the Virtual Museum of Architecture in Ottawa. So I'd really encourage you to check it out sometime, not in the next hour, but at some point check it out. You'll find the URL in the chat. You'll find most of the projects you're seeing tonight online in much more detail, as well as some others. Now, I'll be honest, it's still a work in progress. There's some navigation things to tweak, a few things to correct. It's very much the beta version of the project, but there's still a lot of really, really good content there. And I would really encourage you to check this out and watch the space, because we'll be adding more to it. I expect hopefully a couple more within the next few days will be added to the Hindenburg page. So do check that out. Okay, so with no further ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our 5 speakers, each of whom will give a brief but densely packed presentation tonight. So our first speaker tonight is Anna Teo. And Anna has a BA in art history from Carleton University with a minor in Greek and Roman studies. She received the Senate Medal upon her graduation in June 2025, which is a really singular honor. And she's going to be presenting on Oliver House, or Cuthbertson/Oliver House at 146 Bayswater. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much. Just give me a moment while I share my screen. All right. So you should all be seeing a presentation saying 146 Bayswater right now. It was built in 1886 by David Cuthbertson, who was a well-known builder and contractor in the early days of Ottawa. This building was made for his own family, and he lived there for about 20 years. It's located on the intersection between Bayswater and Gladstone Avenue. It's one of the very few buildings which burnt down in the Great Fire of 1900 in Hintonburg. Hintonburg was largely protected by the train tracks, but 4 buildings, mostly on the line of Bayswater, were burnt down, so he had to rebuild his house. It is 2.5 stories high, and it has a brick veneer. It has had multiple apartments since about 1927. And out of the long list of residents who lived there, the most prominent is probably Herbert James Oliver, who was the chairman of the Ottawa Public School System in 1926. The beauty of this project is that you can find tiny details which eventually lead to much, much larger stories. So while combing through the many artifacts to glean minuscule amounts of information, I sometimes found a really surprisingly valuable artifact. And this newspaper article right here is one of those. It's from 1900. I found it by searching David Cuthbertson on newspaper.com. And it's a list of paragraphs just describing random events that happened in Hintonburg at that time. The article or the paragraph, which relates to David Cuthbertson, merely mentions that he has to rebuild his house. You'll notice that it's from May and the fire of 1900 occurred in April. But there was another paragraph which piqued my interest, which I'll read out to you. In about a week, the factory of Oliver and Son will be completed. Since the middle of May, the company has been busily employed manufacturing furniture for the local trade. Some 40 men are employed. Now, as I mentioned, one of the most prominent residents was an H.J. Oliver, and so I was intrigued to see whether J. Oliver and Sons has anything to do with that resident of 146 Bayswater. After pursuing this line of inquiry a little bit, I discovered the location of the factory. You can see it's on the intersection of Gladstone and Loretta, just a few blocks away from 146 Bayswater. You'll also notice that I relabeled the streets. Gladstone used to be called Oliver Street, presumably because of the factory, and Bayswater, Breeze Hill, and Loretta were respectively 4th, 3rd, and 2nd Avenue. This is because at that time, Bayswater was not a street, but a whole area bound by the Grand Trunk tracks, Carling Avenue, Preston Street, and Parkdale Avenue. So while researching J. Oliver and Sons, I discovered that H.J. Oliver is indeed connected. He is the grandson of the founder, John Oliver. The company was originally founded by William Holgate and John Oliver in 1862. And they built a factory on Victoria Island for the purpose of manufacturing furniture. 10 years later, William Holgate retired, and John Oliver took on his son, James Oliver. They moved to Duke Street in 1879. That building unfortunately burned down. This seemed to be a common theme with the J. Oliver factories. And they made the decision to move to Hintonburg in 1899. At that time, the Sparks estate, which owned most of the farmland around Hintonburg, was quickly selling off different plots of land, and they made a deal with Oliver and Son by which they sold a 5-acre plot for $4,200. Today, that is worth about $100,000. By mid-1900, the factory was up and running, and it quickly became one of the largest furniture companies in Canada. Their westernmost office was located in Winnipeg, and their easternmost office was located in the Maritimes. About a decade or so after the factory was built on Oliver Street, James Oliver's sons joined the company, so now it's the grandsons of the original founder. And H.J. Oliver in particular was superintendent of the factory since at least 1913. During the war, the factory switched from manufacturing furniture to manufacturing war supplies. For example, they spent about 3 months manufacturing only tent pegs. But after the war, they went back to manufacturing specifically hotel and school furniture. In 1923, the last generation of the company took over. Ernest J. Oliver was the great-grandson of the founder and the nephew of H.J. Oliver. Sadly, the company went bankrupt in 1934 because of the Great Depression, and they held their bankruptcy sale, selling off their 3 different buildings to 3 different companies. These were mostly demolished and had new buildings built on the same site. The last original J. Oliver factory building was demolished in the 1960s. Over the course of the company's 70-year tenure, it had a great deal of influence over Canadian furniture. Not in least because Canadian furniture was largely sold domestically. J. Oliver and Sons furniture was found all the way from Vancouver to the Maritimes, and the company clearly made the Oliver family quite affluent. H.J. Oliver, in particular, is listed in owning, buying, and selling and renting many different properties across Ottawa, including, at one point, an entire block of Lisker properties. But probably my favorite accolade for the company comes in this newspaper article from 1913. And I'll read out some quotes from it for you. Furniture in which the dual qualities of artistic design and durability are combined play a more important role in the moral welfare of the nation than might occur to the average person. This being so, the firm of J. A. Oliver and Sons are responsible for affecting the moral welfare to a considerable degree. So from a very small detail, just a tiny paragraph relating to one person who lives in 146 Bayswater, we can construct a story that's large enough to encompass the moral welfare of an entire country. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for that, Anna. Our next speaker is Isra Abid. Isra is a fourth-year combined honors student in History and Theory of Architecture and Law. She completed the History and Theory of Architecture component of that last spring and will finish the law component of that in December. And she'll be speaking to us about St. George's Home. So the floor is yours, Isra.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Isra. Thank you all for being here tonight. Today, I'll be talking about Queen Mary of the Most Holy Rosary Church at 1153 Wellington Street in Hintonburg. To anyone passing by, it's simply a quiet red brick church, modest, familiar, and deeply rooted in this neighborhood's life. But before it became a parish, this same building was a doorway to another world, a world of imagination, empire, and childhood resilience. Tonight, I want to show you how this church connects Ottawa to a global story. The story of the British home children and the child migration scheme that brought them here. The church we see today was founded in 1946 and officially dedicated in 1947. Its parish community quickly grew alongside post-war Ottawa, serving soldiers' families, new immigrants, and long-time residents of Hintonburg. Over the decades, Queen Mary has remained a center of quiet service, Sunday Mass, baptisms, and sometimes it used to be weddings as well. There used to be food drives, and more recently, the Rectory House renovation project, which provides affordable housing for refugees and newcomers. Yet the red brick walls that hold these celebrations once echoed with very different sounds. The shuffle of children's feet, the cries of homesickness, and the prayers of the sisters who cared for them. To understand this building's earlier life, we need to go back to Victorian Britain. Between the 1860s and the 1930s, more than 100,000 children, some orphans, many of them impoverished working class families, were sent from Britain to colonies such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This was the child migration scheme. Officials and church leaders called it an act of mercy, rescuing poor children from the slums and giving them fresh air, open skies, and Christian homes. But behind that language laid other motives. Britain's social reformers saw immigration as a way to reduce urban poverty and to populate the colonies with good British stock. Canada, eager for cheap agricultural labor, welcomed the scheme. The children were often told they were orphans even when their parents were alive. Many crossed the Atlantic alone, clutching name tags or small cardboard boxes that held all of their belongings. On arrival, they were taken to receiving homes like St. George's Home here in Ottawa. There were several throughout Canada, but St. George's Home was the headquarters. They were inspected, cataloged, and then placed in rural farms. Some found kindness, others endured neglect and a lot of abuse. Historians now describe it as a mix of charity, empire, and social engineering, a policy that profoundly shaped Canadian rural life and left a deep mark on these children's identities. Ottawa's link to this migration began in 1895 when the Southwark Catholic Immigration Society opened a small Victorian farmhouse on Wellington Street West called New Orpington Lodge. It was one of the earliest Catholic-run institutions of its kind in Canada. The purpose of the lodge was to provide newly arrived children from England with a safe space to rest and prepare for placements with Catholic families across Ontario and other provinces. Founded with both spiritual and imperial ambitions, it served as a brief stopover. Most children were provided with amenities, and they ended up only staying for a few days before being sent to farms or households seeking domestic help. By 1900, over 800 children had passed through its doors, but conditions were poor. Overcrowded dormitories, inadequate ventilation, and insufficient supervision. A federal inspector's 1904 report demanded change. The building was reconstructed and renamed St. George's Home, and in 1907, the Sisters of Charity of St. Paul took charge. They lived with the children, ran the chapel, cooked, cleaned, and traveled across rural Ontario and Quebec to check on placements. The new red brick structure, the very one that stands today, was officially opened and blessed in 1912, designed by Ottawa architects Horwood, Taylor, and Horwood. It contained separate wings for boys and the girls, classrooms, and small convents for the sisters. Between 1912 and 1935, more than 8,000 children arrived before being distributed throughout the region. For many, it was their first glimpse of Canada and the last time they would ever see their homeland. Imagine the trains pulling in, the rows of small suitcases, and the mixture of fear and excitement. For these children, Hintonburg was both a beginning and an ending. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the kids' stories. Behind every number was a child. The first child that I will be talking about is Robert Dowse, who was 16 when he died here in 1909. He was buried in Notre Dame Cemetery under a numbered marker. No name, no stone. Decades later, his nephew George Dowse was told the Ottawa Citizen, "Ottawa is a city of monuments, and there are people buried in unmarked graves. Nothing fancy, just a stone with a list of names as if they lived." Another was Ken Donovan, who arrived in 1929 at just 15. Wearing short pants in the February cold, he walked from Union Station all the way to St. George's home. Later, he recalled, "There were boys bigger than me, so I stood on my bench and waved my arm." He was sent to a farm near Pembroke, endured hardship, yet eventually served in the Royal Canadian Air Force and helped organize Expo 67. He later said, "Anybody who doesn't love this country has got to be crazy." These stories remind us that the British home children were not just victims, they were also builders of Canada's farms, railways, and families. One of the most powerful voices to emerge from this history belongs to Dave Laurenti, whose father, Joe Laurenti, passed through St. George's home. As Joe lay dying decades later, he began to remember fragments of his childhood. Driving through Renfrew County, he told his son, "They sent a boy from England there in February. He got there at 4 o'clock in the morning and had to wait until 8 before they came for him. That boy was Joe himself." His son Dave dedicated his life to helping other former home children uncover their stories, founding Home Children Canada and lobbying for public recognition. As he told the Ottawa Citizen in 1998, they suffered a silent shame, a shame that also is Canada's and Britain's. Because of these advocates like David Laurenti, the British home children were finally recognized by both governments, and memories were placed across Canada, including one right here in Ottawa. By 1935, the home closed as attitudes towards the child immigration shifted and the Great Depression limited placements. During the Second World War, the building briefly served as the naval quarters. In 1946, it was purchased by the Archdiocese of Ottawa, which transformed it into the parish of the Queen Mary of the Most Holy Rosary Church as we see today. Though its purpose changed, the spirit of care remained. The same structure that once sheltered migrant children now welcomed parishioners, families, and refugees, carrying forward the same compassion in a different form. So just for closing reflections, when you walk past 1153 Wellington Street West, remember that it's more than just a church. It is a living memorial, a site where the stories of empire, faith, and survival intersect. The children who arrived here more than a century ago helped build this country, yet many were forgotten. By remembering them, we give meaning back to the place that once held their first Canadian nights. From a house of welcome to a house of worship, this building has always stood for hope, and its walls still whisper the voices of those who have passed through.
Thank you very, very much, Isra. Our next speaker is Teresa Kuhleman, and Teresa is a history and theory of architecture student at Carleton. Her research explores Ottawa heritage architecture, including projects with PRTY architects, the City of Ottawa, and of course, community associations. So over to you, Teresa.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all for being here and for having me. I'm going to share some stories about the McLean Block on Wellington Street. So the McLean Block was originally called the Commercial Block for D.H. McLean, the building's patron and original owner. The building It is a two-story brick structure which spans from 1008 to 1024 Wellington Street and consists of stores on the ground floor and apartments above. Throughout the years, a variety of grocery stores, gift shops, restaurants, and banks have occupied the first floor units. It was designed in 1914 by prominent Ottawa architect W.E. Noffke. Noffke is known as Ottawa's architect and has contributed significantly in both quality and quantity to Ottawa's urban fabric. The Central Post Office, the Iona Mansions in Hintonburg, and the Blackburn Burroughs Building are only 3 of dozens of examples of Noffke's iconic buildings in Ottawa and elsewhere. So if you compare the McLean Block of today to Noffke's architectural drawings of the building, some differences can be seen. Most obviously, Noffke designed the McLean Block as a 3-story building. The roof of the McLean Block is also different today than it appears in Noffke's drawings. Today, the roof is flat with a straight edge, as opposed to the undulating roof that Noffke originally designed in 1914. There are also fewer windows than Noffke's drawings show, and those that adorn today's building are oriel windows, which protrude with and are supported by a bracket, rather than the flat windows that Noffke's drawing shows that also appear to have balconies. It's hard to say why all of these changes were made. Most likely, Noffke's design was too expensive and it was simplified for financial reasons. However, the McLean Block does also have a history of catching on fire every few years. So it is also possible renovations and repairs are the cause of the discrepancy between the design and the building we know today. So on June 2nd, 1915, the McLean Block experienced its first fire. Doucet and Charbonneau Dry Goods, located at 1016 to 1020 Wellington, experienced the most damage, both to its property and stock. However, 4 other businesses and a few residences were also affected. Police Officer Lord was the first to alert authorities about the fire. Unfortunately, Fire Chief Graham and the rest of the fire department arrived after the fire had spread throughout the building. The fire department experienced a shortage of equipment in 1915 and had only 2 working hoses to put out the fire. In total, around $12,000 of damage occurred, but fortunately, aside from the dry goods store and the apartment above, which belonged to Mrs. P. O'Meara, the building was not damaged beyond repair. Doucet and Charbonneau had a fire sale to sell off their damaged goods at a reduced price, and fortunately, they did not have to close the shop. So the most damaging fire of the McLean Block occurred on the 22nd of July, 1938. This fire eventually led to citywide improvements in Ottawa's firefighting technology and strategies. The fire began at 1020 Wellington Street. It spread quickly throughout the building and to the roof. It's possible damage from this fire may be why the roof appears so different today than in Noffke's plan. The Ottawa Fire Department, led by Fire Chief O'Kelly, arrived at the scene with 5 of Ottawa's pumpers. Ottawa's only aerial was also employed at the scene. It took the firefighters over 3 hours to put out the fire. Fortunately, no one was harmed, but $80,000 of damage was caused, both through damage to the building and to stocks in the stores. Furthermore, all of Ottawa's firefighting equipment, save 1 pumper, was present at this fire. So should another fire have started at a different building at the same time, there would likely have been insufficient equipment to put it out. So this fire led to Fire Chief O'Kelly implementing some changes in Ottawa's firefighting strategies. First, the department acquired a second aerial. O'Kelly was convinced that if they had had a second aerial while fighting this fire, it would have been under control in less than an hour. Second, he started lobbying for a new alarm system throughout Ottawa. The current system was archaic and ineffective, and manufacturers had stopped making necessary parts for this system all the way back in the 1910s. So clearly it was time for change. The most recent fire documented at the McLean Block occurred on March 23rd, 1987. The fire destroyed 4 of the 11 apartments and 4 of the 7 stores. In total, 9 individuals lost their homes and 4 of the businesses on the first floor closed. Lino's Pasta, the ABC Gift Co., Silver Salver Caterers, and the Wishbone Gift Shop were all put out of business. It was in the Wishbone Gift Shop, located at 1024 Wellington Street and owned by Gordon Jobson, that the fire started, seemingly due to faulty wiring. Gordon Jobson had opened his shop only 1 month prior and admitted he would not be able to start another business due to the financial loss. Fire Chief Cecil Fields and 30 Ottawa firefighters fought the fire for 3 hours before subduing it. Fortunately, every resident of the McLean Block, including the children of the families in the apartment, successfully escaped this fire. Ultimately, examining the McLean block reveals insight into various aspects of the Hintonburg community and its history, from design practices to residential everyday life, to how buildings were susceptible to fire, to how firefighting practices have changed in the community over time. And on a broader scale, the fact that so much local history can be gleaned from this one building alone points to the possibilities of other equally interesting and informative stories being hidden within Ottawa architecture around Hintonburg and Ottawa as a whole. Architecture's value extends past practicality into a realm where buildings can hold value as physical archives of local community history. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Our next speaker is Zaid Hashim. And Zaid, I guess as of literally a few weeks ago, has been a graduate student in urban planning at the University of Toronto. In his heyday, of course, he was a BA student in the History and Theory of Architecture program at Carleton with minors in urban studies and heritage conservation. And Zaid graduated last spring, and he's going to talk to us about the Capital Wire Cloth Factory. So, floor is yours, Zaid.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. 7 Hinton Avenue embodies traces of a forgotten history. The address stands as a rare and remarkable reminder of Hintonburg's industrial heritage that seems almost incomprehensible today. Built in 1912, this heritage-designated site originally housed the Capital Wire Cloth Manufacturing Company, which was founded by J.R. Buchanan. The building itself is notable as it showcases features of the early 20th century industrial architecture, now a rare style in Hintonburg. The style is characterized by a functional layout, open floor plan, and use of raw materials, and this is evident at 7 Hinton, where the building's key features include its notable arched windows and exterior silica lime brick masonry, as you can see here on the slide. Through its lifespan, the factory expanded significantly with many additions, and it now occupies an entire city block bounded by Hinton Avenue, Spencer Street, Hamilton Avenue, and Armstrong Street. So you might be wondering, what exactly is wire cloth? So basically, it's a type of metal mesh which was formed by weaving wires into a durable pattern. This product was an essential material in the paper-making processes of the 19th and 20th centuries and helped support the lumber industry, which was booming in Ottawa during the early 1900s. You can see here on the slide, that's just like a smaller version of a wire cloth, and on the right is a little sketch of what it could have looked like in a factory of the time. And just for more reference, here's just some imagery from the early 1900s of paper production, and you can see that on the bottom left, there's like horizontal and vertical screens, and that's kind of where the wire cloth would have been in this process. So very cool imagery. So digging through newspapers.com for primary sources, an Ottawa Citizen article I found from March 27th, 1913, became the stepping stone for much of my research regarding the building. Just to extract some quotes from the article, one of the main headlines, it says, "Many up-to-date concerns established in Hintonburg, this splendid district, a rapidly growing commercial center." And down below, it talks about the wirecloth factory. So it says, "The Capital Wirecloth Manufacturing Company in Hintonburg is now well established in their new plant and is in splendid shape to handle business. At the present time, the factory is running to capacity, and it is probable that extensions will be made in the near future." So from this article, I was kind of able to develop and establish a historical timeline, tracing the triumphs, evolutions, and renewal that occurred between the factory's inception over a century ago until the modern day. And just for the sake of today's presentation, I'll be mainly focusing on highlighting some early histories of this factory. And I will talk about this guy on the left a little more, but that is J.R. Buchanan, the original president of the company. And this is actually one of the only photos I can find of the interior from the time. So very interesting there. So it all began in 1902 when the Capital Wire Cloth Company purchased the plot of land from the Ottawa Land Association. It was a consortium of landowners of which Nicholas Sparks was a part of. And of course, Sparks Street is named after him. And then by 1907, Hintonburg had been annexed into the city of Ottawa, becoming the, quote, West End. This new identity spurred potential, and manufacturing quickly took off. The wire cloth factory began construction on May 6, 1912, and as I said, by 1913, it was fully operational. So its construction was actually contracted by a Hintonburg resident of the time, George Umbridge. Originally from London, England, he made a career in Ottawa's building trade between 1885 and 1912. So his retirement in 1912 makes it clear that this factory, the Capital Wirecloth factory, was actually one of the last jobs that he undertook. And Umbridge passed away in 1934 and is actually buried in the Beechwood Cemetery, which is near Vanier. I found that out through another article that I had dug up at that from newspapers.com. So as mentioned earlier, J.R. Buchanan served as the president of the Wirecloth factory. And in its early years, he actually had moved from Wisconsin to Ottawa to prepare for the factory opening. And I was able to find a little bit about him. There was actually a similar factory in Wisconsin. So interesting connection there that I wasn't aware of before. But it was clear that Buchanan had the Ottawa Civic Publicity Department to thank for securing the wirecloth industry in the city. So I've inserted some snapshots from the articles. Unfortunately, they're not very clear because they are very old, but the department essentially existed to help promote and secure industrial activity throughout the city, especially in quote unquote booming areas, which Hintonburg had become at this time. And this is evident with the wirecloth factory itself and neighboring factory buildings that had once existed. And actually just north of where the factory is now at 7 Hinton, there was another huge factory. It was called the Beach Foundry, and it actually had an active rail connection to it. So it was a very big site. I believe it's housing nowadays. So you wouldn't believe that it was a factory back then, but yes. So this shared history between this general area helps illuminate a time when industrial buildings dominated the region. And as I said, it's quite hard to believe because taking a walk, it's pretty residential there. So, oops. The publicity department, as said by Buchanan, was receiving huge praise in 1913. And the publicity commissioner at the time had cited the committee as being the reason why the city was flourishing. And to add on to this, the efforts of the publicity department to actually bring the Capital Wirecloth factory to the city had produced a capital of $50,000 and a payroll of over $15,000 in less than its first year of operation. However, this success kind of shifted by the end of 1915 when the Publicity Bureau was supposedly discontinued. Considering sort of the context of the time, perhaps the First World War influenced the closure of anything considered excess spending. And I found out about this bureau closure through an assertive but quite intense letter by J.R. Buchanan, who it was directed towards a news editor. And Buchanan was disputing claims that, quote, every industry established in Ottawa through the efforts of the Bureau had been discontinued. And instead, he had asserted that the Capital Wirecloth factory was indeed still operating and quite successful as it was preparing for a growing expansion. You can see this here. This isn't all the images I had found, but just for the sake of the slides, I just put up some key ones. But you can kind of trace the evolution of from when it started in a little corner, sort of gained more space, and now it took up the whole block. And actually, the success of the factory continued for many decades, with the first expansion happening in 1919, and then 1925, and finally in 1948, where you can see it kind of taking up the whole block. And I would say from my research that the peak of this factory kind of occurred in 1961, where I found out that the factory had earned a surplus of over $1.2 million. And that was fairly, it was very highlighted in many of the newspapers from that early 60s. But this success did not last for long. And actually by the 1970s, there was a shifting industry towards plastics. And that basically rendered the wirecloth industry unprofitable because instead of weaving metal wires, plastic kind of took over, and hence the factory was no longer useful. And it was actually abandoned for a number of years. And during this time, many different sort of proposals went underway. There was a Parkdale outdoor-indoor market that kind of had an architectural study being done. Nothing really came to fruition. But by 1983, the Metcalfe Realty Company acquired the site, and under heritage architect Barry Podolsky, a complete rehabilitation occurred. And this is kind of leading us to where we are now. but I thought I'd highlight some of the residents or tenants, I'll say, that were in the space during this time. So the Hintonburg Animation Studio that produced the Raccoons cartoon series was a tenant during the 80s. In addition to, there was a science company named Biologicals, which I had tried to trace some more histories of, and they're kind of connected all over Canada, but I thought that was interesting. And there was also a number of Canadian habitat and natural resource companies that were tenants in this site. The evolving nature of the site has allowed it to continue to be memorable within the community. Its rehabilitation and connection to many different eras sheds light on the unknown stories that are present, while still evoking a strong sense of place within Hintonburg and the surrounding community. And thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you very much, Said. Our final presenter tonight is Tyler Doyle Chenard. And Tyler is a fourth-year art history major at Carleton University. Through his studies, he has developed his appreciation for architectural design and heritage preservation, and he'll be presenting to us tonight about the Crawley Film Building. Over to you, Tyler.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the opportunity. So my research was on the Crawley Films headquarters at 19 Fairmont Avenue, and the aim of my research was to study the history of the property and the architectural evolution of the building, and this would be done through the lens of the rise and success of Crawley Films in Hintonburg. I have my presentation set up through recording, so let me just get the recording going. The aim of my research was to study the history of the property and the architectural evolution of the building situated at 19 Fairmont Avenue. The result is an online exhibit that tells a story of how and why Frank and Judith Crawley, pioneers of the Canadian film and television industry, built the headquarters of their production company, Crawley Films, in Hintonburg. The narrative that unfolded was that the building became symbolic of the architectural journey of the rise and success of a Canadian film industry giant called Crawley Films, thus the title of this presentation. The company started small in 1939 and evolved in the Crawley Films Limited in 1946, expanding into larger state-of-the-art facilities in 1954, as seen in the picture to the left. Crawley Films continued operating there in some capacity until the early 1980s, when it was sold. Nonetheless, study of the building, its architecture, and its origin tells the story of the rise and peak of this Canadian film industry giant. Today, the building is occupied by Ottawa Police Services, repurposed since 2009 and with a lease renewed to this day. Returning the subject of the building as the headquarters of Crawley Films, sadly, I uncovered very little about the planning and design of the structure and its interior spaces. What I found was limited to the content of newspaper photographs and articles, as well as archived city assessment rolls, fire insurance plans, and information written on the web by Mikel Crawley, daughter of Frank and Judith Crawley, or in biographical accounts of the life of Frank Crawley written by Barbara Rose Wade, or that were published by James Forster. Frank R. Crawley, also known as Budge, and Judith Sparks were born in Ottawa in 1911 and 1914 respectively. They grew up as neighbors in the Glebe on driveway along the canal. They married and started operating their production company, first in 1939 from the attic of Arthur Crawley's home, Budge's father, in the Glebe at 540 Drive. On the screen is a photograph I took of Arthur Crawley's residence and the attic where the company received its first film orders from the National Film Board of Canada. The NFB also originated in the same time frame in Ottawa. The Crawleys were committed to making Ottawa their base instead of moving to Hollywood. Here you can see a newspaper shot of Budge and Judith Crawley. Below you see Arthur Crawley, who was instrumental in launching and funding the company, as well as scouting the space and the land in Hintonburg on Fairmont Avenue. The Crawleys' expansion to Hintonburg was subject to local news coverage, with an example seen on the slide. Crawley Films moved from the attic to a studio in an old church hall in 1945, St. Matthias on Fairmont Avenue, seen on the slide. It became incorporated in 1946. Through the years, it saw several additions to the church hall built between 1948 and 1950, often covered in local news. The company went from functioning in a space for 3 employees in 1939 in the attic to 6 in 1946, and then 33 in 1949, operating from the church hall, and 100 in 1955 upon occupying the new building at 19 Fairmont Avenue. The studio also evolved in its functional requirements, which needed to accommodate more staff, film equipment, filming studios, dark rooms, projection spaces, production suites, and much more. This is a Canadian story of change that reflected the times where there were more movie theaters across Canada and the US, including in Hintonburg. Television was in its infancy and starting to require more production content, and schools were using documentary film reels to support teaching. With this as a backdrop, the story began and evolved for Crawley Films. The fire insurance plans that I found at the city archives, shown on the slide, are also evidence of the physical and spatial growth of the company. If you look at the plans on the bottom right, you can see in pink what the building was in 1946 in terms of shape and surface and as brick construction. And at the top left corner, you see the 1956 fire insurance plan that shows the new expansion, made of fire-resistant materials and concrete blocks. What's most important is noticing the expansion and extension to the street. In 1953, the company had already won multiple awards and recognition for its films. Canadians and Americans commissioned productions from Crawley Films. The success and growth of the company necessitated a building in size, architectural style, and technological sophistication that communicated its prominence and displayed its innovative advancements in audiovisual production. What you see on the slide are, to the left, the Crawleys examining models of the design for the new building. In the center and to the right are stills from the VHS of the construction of the new building, with the church hall in the background. Ottawa architects William James Abra and Watson Bahari designed the new headquarters, which the firm of George A. Crane & Sons Limited were recruited to construct. In the 1955 flat-roofed rectangular box glass and brick addition had architectural elements that broke with the architectural styles of the past and projected into a post-war era. Key characteristics included a steel frame, a brick exterior with picture windows, and no representational decorative ornaments. The picture windows allowed for natural light and a connection to the outdoor scenery. While the style was modernist, the use of brick allowed for a touch of classic aesthetic that fit in with the neighborhood. Notwithstanding the brick, 19 Fairmont Avenue captured the idea of modernist architecture with its minimalism. The rectangular block shape with a horizontal expression of repetitive picture windows, horizontal layers of brick bands gave the structure the impression of simplicity, lightness, order, and regularity expected in a modernist office building. Upon completion of the addition, newspapers reported on the interior of the building, which they described as the most modern film studio in Canada. They described the interior as painted in pastel colors, with dedicated rooms for film production. It had a sound recording suite with floating floors to eliminate noise and vibrations. They explained the layout of each floor, with on the first floor a reception area, a state-of-the-art theater for projections, the animation studios and their equipment, executive offices, a cafeteria, labs, and a power station. On the second floor was a large soundstage for indoor and outdoor shots, nearby dressing rooms with makeup rooms, and set and prop storage space. The music, engineering, and camera departments and studios were on this floor. On the third floor could be found script writing and production units. Unfortunately, photographs of the exterior and interior have not been located. As the building is now leased to the Ottawa Police Services, the novelty of its heyday has gone and the modernist building has been repurposed. Luckily, it has not been demolished, and a move to protect and conserve similar type structures grow to be part of the historical and architectural heritage of our cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tyler. So before I pass it over to Linda, I just want to conclude with basically with a few thank yous and acknowledgements. First of all, thank you, of course, to Heritage Ottawa for giving us the opportunity to share this work tonight. It's been a wonderful thing for all of us involved in the project. Thanks very much to the Heritage Committee at the Hintonburg Community Association, especially Jean Inch and Linda Hode, for their enthusiastic participation in this project and their generosity in sharing their time and their expertise with our students. I also want to thank our Audiovisual Resource Center in the Art and Architectural History program at Carleton, who host the website, the web version of this, and without their help, none of this would be able to be disseminated to the public in the way that it will be possible to do so. And I also want to acknowledge another of our HTA students, Maria Yer Hernandez, for an enormous amount of work she put into getting a lot of the presentations ready to go on the website, especially in the aftermath of a rather catastrophic technical meltdown we had with our web platform last spring. So we couldn't have done that without her. Last of all, of course, thank you so much to all of our presenters for giving us this wonderful portrait of Hintonburg in 5 buildings. To the audience, you've just had a glimpse of the work they've done. For more, go to the website, dig more deeply into their project, and stay tuned because there will be more where that came from. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you. I want to echo Peter's thanks to all of the speakers. It's just been amazing. As you know, Jean Inch and I sort of started you off with a bit of a background and I guess some suggestions of sources that you might be able to use. And you have done such amazing work. I'm really very pleased to hear your reports. I do have one question that I'm posing to all of you, I guess. We've often said, oh, there aren't any important architects represented in Hintonburg. Nofke was the only one I knew about. So I guess I'd be interested to know how much trouble was it to dig out the information about the architects of your buildings? I guess the only one who didn't have an architect, only a builder, was the Oliver House. So maybe, I guess maybe I'll start with Anna, because you did Oliver House. Was it how was it? How were you able to establish that he actually built the house, or?
I couldn't find an architect at all. I was actually given the information that it was built by David Cuthbertson, and then I just went from there. And as I mentioned, I found out that he lived there and then he moved to different places. Like he is listed as having lived in 146 Bayswater.
Okay, Isra, how about St. George's Home?
So the architect that I found was Howard, Taylor and Howard. It was actually really hard for me to find. I had to go through several newspaper articles because of all the renovations that happened with the building. They had to completely reconstruct it once after it was the lodge, the New Brinton Lodge. They had to just completely demolish it and then reconstruct it on the same site and then open it and rename it to St. George's Home. So due to that, there's not a lot of information for the architect. So yeah, it took a lot of time to find it.
Hey, Teresa, McLean Block. Well, you don't have to answer that because we all know that McLean Block was Nofke. How about Zaid?
Yeah, so it wasn't too hard to find out. I had been doing research into the president, like J.R. Buchanan, the first president of the Capitol Wire Cloth Factory. There wasn't a lot of preliminary info I had about him, but once I started digging, I found some articles, and that's when I sort of read one of them, and it had stated that the construction was contracted by George Umbridge. So then from there, I was able to kind of search for that name, and then I found out like when he retired and kind of where he's buried now, and found out more information there.
Okay, and how about Tyler? How was it hard to find out who the architect was for the Crawley building?
It wasn't difficult at all. What happened with me was that I went through newspapers.com as my starter and I looked for articles on the building. Then I found out the names of the architects and that led me to the firm and then that everything else just fell into place. I just wish I was able to find like documents relating to the, the building, like the blueprints or the design schematics for it. That would have been great to include.
Yes, don't we all wish for those plans? I have a question, actually, Tyler, another one for you. The person is asking, were the architects building specialists in film studios, given the particular elements of the interior?
I don't believe they were specialists in like film production, like less that I could see from like what I was able to glean from my research, but they were most likely contracted by they were working with, most likely what happened is they worked with the firm and they worked with like Budge and Judith Crawley, like in order to make sure that the needs for the film production were met. And then they designed the building according to those wants and needs. Again, it would have been great to get the blueprints for this because it would have like allowed more insight with proper primary sourcing.
Okay, and someone has asked again for the website that Peter mentioned, the Carleton website. I don't, can you perhaps put it up again, Jen? I did see it early on, but, or yeah, you'd have to put it in the chat. I've had two congratulations. Can you see it? I'm sorry, I don't know who the person was who asked the question, but there it is on the web, on the screen, if you can copy it. You can also, I guess, Virtual Museum of, what's the title? Virtual Museum of
Architecture in Ottawa, or VMAO we call it.
Aha. Yes, Google's very helpful if you can get started on something as distinctive as that. So I've had two thank yous from viewers who've been very impressed with your presentations. And I guess one of the other things that I think about in terms of Hintonburg, because I do, as you probably know, I do walking tours of Hintonburg, and one of the themes is adaptive reuse. And quite a few of these buildings exhibit changes in use over time. So maybe each of you could comment a little on how you see adaptive reuse. Let me see. Let's start with Israel. Your building it had changes of use, and I guess, you know, is that something you feel is important, or does it set a good example?
I think so. Since my building kind of went through different stages in the years, it started off as a really big. It essentially started with benefactors that wanted to come together and provide homes for children who were living in destitute poor conditions. And then throughout the years, as we see Canada kind of evolving and going through everything, we saw a major shift towards how the building and the people were able to adapt to the conditions that it was in. So I think it does play a really big factor. Yeah.
Okay. I guess another good example might be Zaid. How did you see that adaptive reuse process?
Yeah, so obviously considering the very residential character of the neighborhood right now, I think that like the whole transformation into now it's a bunch of tenants, which are businesses, has helped kind of integrate the building into the community nowadays. And I think just in general, adaptive reuse is like very good at, well, being sustainable and preserving the materials that are already there, but also in allowing for the ongoing telling of different stories. And I think that's very evident with the wire cloth factory. I do think that it's something that should be considered more for many different, not just in Hintonburg, but everywhere in Ottawa. I think adaptive reuse has the potential to be very beneficial. And I think, yeah, I think hopefully that touched upon that. But I think just the fact that it had been adaptively reused is what allows it to kind of be integrated well into the community nowadays.
Great, thanks. And Tyler, how about you?
So for the adaptive reuse, I'd argue that the building, while it's doing a good job at being like a support, like a corporate support for the Ottawa Police Services in regards to their planning, performance, and analytics, it's not exactly using like the full feature suite that the architects designed for the building. Because when you look at like a structure like, say, the various CBC offices in, say, Ottawa or Montreal or Toronto, like they're not the exact same as they were in the 50s, but at the same time, they're still using a good chunk of the features that they've had and they've integrated more over the years. Whereas this, it's mostly just like a planning and analytical divisions for the OPS. So it's still being of use, and you could argue that it is integrating well in the community, but it's not taking advantage of the building and the way it was originally designed.
Okay, thank you. I've got an interesting question from another listener. How would you recommend that these stories could be shared with people? Most of these buildings, or many of them, have little visible interpretation. Have you thought about how you could, in addition to giving this lecture tonight, how we could give the people of Hintonburg, the passersby, interpretation, a little bit of you know, the history of what they're passing, what they're walking by. Maybe I'll start with Teresa, because your building didn't fit the other questions particularly. And as a residential home, not a business or a reused, I guess, office or factory building, can you think of any way that we could interpret the history and the stories that it tells?
I think one of the most straightforward ways probably would be to have some kind of plaque on or around the premises of buildings, especially if they're public ones. It might be trickier if they're private. Another thing that I've kind of been working on in some of my classes that I think can be a great way for disseminating knowledge and stories about buildings are interactive maps. And I think those can be incorporated physically into buildings through posters and QR codes. But I think that's another like great way to like encourage people to actively engage and like explore their neighborhood and their cities is through interactive maps. So yeah.
Good, thank you. Isra?
I think these stories could be possibly told through community-based telling, as well as I agree with Teresa with plaques as well being put. Things like neighborhood history walks, short documentary projects, or even school partnerships could make the history feel more alive. A lot of my stories were kind of, you had to dig a little bit deeper into learning more about them. And so I think it's really important to just kind of start talking about them and not be afraid to kind of dig for these stories and actually be able to talk about things that are harder to talk about, like the one that my building shares. So yeah.
Anna. Sorry, I was mixing yours up with Teresa's, but
It's okay. Yeah, I agree with both Teresa and Isra. It's quite difficult for just like a passerby to know, oh, this building it has such an interesting story. I should know more about it. So I think putting up a plaque and having a little bit of information and then maybe a QR code that leads you to the website or, you know, an interactive map is a really good way to get any random passerby interested in it. And then once they're interested in it, then they can discover, oh, there's a lecture on this building or a lecture on Hintonburg, or there's like guided tours around Hintonburg, and I can go to one of those and I learn so much more. Okay, I think we have to start by catching their attention and letting them know that there's something greater and bigger there.
okay. Peter.
I just wanted to add, I agree with everything Teresa and Isra and Anna have said, but I just want to add a couple of things. One is, of course, we're sharing it. They're sharing theirs, in fact, in the Virtual Museum. So that is available to anyone right now. But another thing is there's technology out there, and it's really not that hard to find now, where an interactive map that you'd operate on your phone is paired with it could be blocks of text, historical images, audio clips. That can be done without having to erect anything on site. There's no infrastructure on site at all. And I think this sort of project and many others that would be comparable would make wonderful versions of that kind of self-guided walking tour where you're following a tour on your phone. And I say the technology's out there. I've used it in other communities. It would take a bit of money, a bit of funding, because it costs a bit to buy into that technology and get your stuff set up there. It would take a bit of time, certainly, but full disclosure, I've actually thought sometimes that, that would make a great retirement project for me. So, still working with students and training them in this sort of thing and nurturing those skills and going out into communities and providing this sort of thing that absolutely anybody with a phone can access. So that's out there, hopefully down the road as well.
Okay. So going back to the original question, I'll ask, I guess I'll ask Zaid, how would you interpret what you've learned about this building so that more people or people going by would understand it?
For sure. I think echoing off what has been said, panels are of course a great idea, and also the fact that we do have this project sort of in the virtual setting. I think that's helping amplify these hidden stories. I have kind of two thoughts on that note. I think other projects I've done at Carleton also have involved kind of like virtual reality of a space with the program called Eon XR. I think that's an interesting option, kind of if we're able to implement that in some way, maybe with virtual reality, including some of the artifacts that we've found, whether newspapers or imagery. But another one that I just kind of thought about, but through my research, it was hard to do this, but I know a lot of historic spaces have sort of public art as well. And I think in the case of the wire cloth factory, maybe displaying some sort of artifact in relation to the factory history, whether it's a wire cloth or machinery that I had a few images of, sort of publicly and ingrained into the site, could be very interesting to passerbyers and kind of create a more dynamic feel for the street instead of just the building itself. But just an idea that came to mind also in that sense is like I'm thinking about the distillery district in Toronto, how these old factories have like art outside of it, kind of what the factory produced or kind of machinery from there. And I think, I don't know, I just thought of that as a cool idea that could help tell the story about a factory.
Okay, Tyler?
Personally, I'm in agreement with what everyone else has said. Like a plaque and a QR code, it's a great way to introduce like the building to other people and allow them to learn more information. But considering the fact my building is relating to the Canadian film industry, something relating to like film would work well, like with educating others on like the building and the importance of Crawley films to the Canadian landscape. Like if something like a Heritage Minute or like a documentary was made on Crawley films, like it would go a long way to educating and informing. Because again, this is a very like forgotten part in the Canadian film landscape, especially when compared to the NFB, which is still around today.
Great. Okay, I have a question for you, Zaid. Were you able to learn anything about the factory workers or the working conditions the building design offered? And if so, do you know if the workers lived within Hintonburg or generally the West End?
That was actually one of my first main questions when I was going into the research. I was really wanting to know more about factory workers, and also I know some of my other peers here were able to kind of unpack the residents and their relation to their site. I had such a hard time in actually finding documents about the workers, so I wasn't able to actually learn about the conditions. I think uh, my extent that I was able to find was just the president of the company and the contractor of the site. But when I had looked into sort of the interior of the factory and like who worked there, what it even looked like, there was very little documentation about that. So if I was to ever do some more research into this project, I would want to continue on this thread. So that was a very good question, but unfortunately, I did not find much info about that area.
Okay, thank you. I think yes, Peter.
So I just want to add to that, for anyone interested in that, on November 24th in the evening, the Hintonburg Community Association is hosting a history night, second such thing they've done. It's a live event, which will be in the Hintonburg Community Center. And one of the presenters there will be Keegan Spielman, who's a grad student who also took part in this course, and he's going to be presenting on workers' housing in Hintonburg. So if that topic is of interest to you, then that event will be of interest to you.
Thank you for the plug, Peter. I don't have too many more questions, so I thought I would finish with a compliment. The listener said, I wanted to say thank you and great job to presenters and organizers. I lived in the area for 27 years during the 80s, 90s, 20s, and passed by these buildings without knowing the history behind them. Thank you for saying their names. I'm looking forward to following the website. So I think that's a very positive note to end on. And I want to add my personal thanks to all of you for taking this on and learning so much about buildings that I knew a little bit about and was often curious about and never had quite had the time to follow up on some of the leads. So it's been really wonderful hearing your the results of your research, and I do look forward to working or looking at them in more detail and the other projects that were done on the website. So I would I guess I have to wrap up things. So if anyone does have additional questions, you can send them to info@heritageottawa.org and we will share them with the speakers and you may get some answers. I want to thank you all once again for your presentations and Peter for hosting or for leading the class in this interesting project. I'd kind of forgotten how it started, Peter. It was nice to be reminded. Before we end, I want to share with you that our November lecture will be presented online by David Jeans, board member of Heritage Ottawa and former president. David's richly illustrated presentation will focus on the varied career of 19th century architect Thomas Seton Scott. Please register for the lecture on our website at heritageottawa.org. I also need to tell you about another upcoming event. As tax season approaches, yes, it will be that time of year again soon, you might consider donating securities, mutual fund shares, or life insurance to Heritage Ottawa. It's an efficient way to give charitably since capital gains tax does not apply. To help make this decision easier for you in time for the 2025 tax season, we're hosting a free webinar, Tax Benefits When Gifting Securities to Charity. This is going to be held November the 6th, 2025 from 7 to 8:30 p.m. via Zoom. Our guest speaker will be Douglas Lai, an accomplished wealth advisor and portfolio manager at Scotia McLeod. There is no cost for this event, but pre-registration is necessary from the Heritage Ottawa website. So if you're interested in a tax-free donation to Heritage Ottawa, please join the webinar. And finally, as mentioned at the beginning, Heritage Ottawa lectures are provided free of charge. We encourage you to join Heritage Ottawa if you're not already a member, and to donate to the organization to help continue efforts to share heritage stories. Information on membership and donations are available on the Heritage Ottawa website. And with that, thank you for joining us tonight and good night to all.